Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and as you can probably tell, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the double-bladed sword. Now, the double-bladed sword has appeared in pop culture in various iterations. I think one of the most popular and iconic is Darth Maul's double-bladed lightsaber, but a double-bladed sword like this also appears in, say, Dungeons & Dragons 3 and 3.5. And I think there's a couple of animes that have double-bladed swords as well. So what I want to try and explore in this video is, are these things even practical? Now, I have seen a couple of videos that actually say this is a piece of junk, why would you ever do it, there's no point. And I've also seen a couple of videos defending it. So what are my opinions? And ultimately, this is speculation, okay? I do have a background in martial arts and historical swordsmanship, and I'll be applying my own understanding and knowledge of that stuff to this kind of weapon. And there is a lot to try and analyze and break down. Now, just to let you know how I constructed this monstrosity, this is actually two Rollings synthetic nylon practice swords. And because they actually have an internal core that's basically a giant screw, all you need is an oversized nut right there, and they screw together really well. It's like how I'm made to do it. Not really. So yeah, you just remove the pommel from the swords, screw them together, and you actually have a really functional training double-bladed sword, because these are made to take like huge impacts, okay, and to simulate the approximate weight. They're not perfectly, they're a little bit on the lighter end, but the weight is still a very good analog for a real sword. And so when you put them together, this actually makes a really functional practice double-bladed sword. Well, look at that. First, I want to explore functionality, and then after that, practicality. And when I look at this, how practical a weapon is this in real life, that actually informs us somewhat, I feel, as to why it didn't really exist in history. Now, I do have some vague memories of me trying to play around pretending a stick is a double-bladed weapon, and I always held it like this. And I think in a lot of TV shows and stuff, they fight with it, you know, holding it like this. This is how Darth Maul usually holds his. He had a bit more kind of grip or length on his handle, but generally fighting with it this way, okay? You know, just two hands. Now, when I just hold it like this and try and go through different moves, okay, there is a measure of, you know, functionality that you could get out of it. But what I'm finding is that the cross guards, if you actually have cross guards, they tend to get in the way of your edge alignment, especially if you're holding like, because just by virtue of the length of this handle, my hands need to go on an inwards angle like that for me to hold it, because it's shorter than the width of my shoulder. So maybe if this was further out, the cross guard wouldn't be as detrimental, but because my hands need to be angled inwards when I hold it, that means the cross guard can't flip up and down past my forearms with any amount of ease. And so because that gets in the way, you might think, well, it's not an effective weapon. Well, no, it's not as effective. You can still get a measure of effect, but it's not as effective when you hold it this way. You don't have to hold it this way. In actual fact, when I was, you know, my own experimentation, holding it like a spear actually nullifies that problem completely and gives you more options fighting. I find you can present the tip to your opponent much easier. You can actually even get more reach if you want, like fully leaning out. And look, because my handle is essentially doubled from a regular longsword, I get way more reach in a thrust, and it gives you a lot of options, all right? And so when I was experimenting with this thing, I was finding that, my goodness, this isn't nearly as terrible as some people have said. So the obvious comparison between a double-bladed sword is with a single-bladed sword. But it's not only that. What about comparing it to a spear? Because this is now a polearm, all right? You wouldn't, it's wrong to really call it a sword. I'm not really fighting it like a sword. I'm not holding a sword grip. I think one of the best grips, as I mentioned, is like a spear, okay? A double-bladed swordy spear. But still, let's compare it to a regular sword. Put double-bladed sword there. Like my new sword, you might recognize it. This was Scarlegrim's, and he was selling it. When I heard that he was selling it, I was like, well, I know someone who might like to buy it. Oh, so nice. So my own personal impression when comparing a regular longsword to a double-bladed sword is that the initial engagement can be pretty much the same. There's really only a couple of guard positions that you wouldn't be able to do with a regular sword, because remember, the double-bladed sword is just a sword with a sword on the other end, okay? And so, however way you want to place your guard, you can do that with a double-bladed sword. So off the bat, they're quite equivalent, except if you're doing it like this. If you had, you know, a wrath position or something, well, you have a blade that you can actually present to your opponent already and spin it around. So if I wanted to try and kind of do a wrath guard with a double-bladed sword, I would actually want to keep my point on point, right? Presenting to the opponent, very similar to one of the positions that you hold when fighting with a poleaxe, okay? Because there are actually other weapons historically that are essentially kind of double-bladed. The poleaxe is one of them because on the opposite end, sometimes they have a spike, a metal spike. Not always, but sometimes. And so one of the guard positions, you'd have the poleaxe on one end, hold that ready for a big strike, and you present that spike, that tip, to your opponent so you can still thrust with it. This is a very similar guard position, and so you can keep your opponent at guard or at bay, and then if they try and attack, you have a very strong defensive point to just knock something aside, and then you're ready to follow up. Knock aside and then hit. And this blade essentially should be pushing aside your opponent's weapon, leaving them open for a counter strike, which is very quick. This is, I think, one of the biggest advantages about a double-bladed sword. I have heard some arguments saying that a regular sword is just as quick. Let's break that down. A regular sword can be very quick. I'm not saying it isn't. So if you knock a strike aside, you can follow up with a reverse cut very quickly. Just hit, and you can keep running into your opponent. So just deflect, strike, thrust, hit. So these are all pretty darn fast attacks, whether it was a block, parry, or a post, that whatever length of time it took for me to spin it around, that length of time would have been halved if I was using a double-bladed sword. And so if I let in with a strike, or I just raised a guard, and then I wanted to spin to do a reverse cut on the other end, the length of time it takes for my blade to re-engage is halved with the double-bladed sword because it's right there. The blade would be here, where I go to strike and block and just hit with the other end. That's actually very darn quick. With a regular sword, like I said, all the way around to hit with the other end, this, half the time. This is a significant advantage that I don't think we should disregard. It's very well worth analyzing and trying to consider seriously. Now, in my opinion, one of the best moves with a longsword is a single tempo riposte, where your guard, your defense, is an attack in one move. And I was watching this longsword tournament where one of the opponents pulled one off, and it was just beautiful, where he just simply had a low guard, his opponent came in with a high strike, and he just brought in like that, just straight up. He caught the opponent's blade with a perfect block, and the tip of his sword went right underneath his opponent's armpit, right there, just bang, right in. Oh, that was a beautiful move. Very quick, so decisive. A single tempo riposte. Now, when you do that, there's really no need for a secondary blade. But as soon as you go into a two-tempo move, whatever it is, two moves, this is where the double-bladed sword actually has really significant advantages. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many second tempo moves that you can do that don't require you to move your blade too much, especially if you want to engage with a Zornhau and finish with a thrust. Well, there's really no extra position here to put your sword into for that second move. So I'm not saying the double-bladed sword would be better in every regard. I'm just saying in a lot of situations, it has some significant advantages. Keeping your blade on point and keeping your opponent at a measurable distance away from you, because again, this is a long blade, right? And then ready to defend in any way. Like you've got a full defensive action here where you can defend your upper body and lower body pretty darn effectively, okay? And with whatever defensive move that you want, and you don't have to wait for your opponent to attack you, you got this blade right there, you can thrust, you can go to any number of attacks, but whatever you do, you have a second attack all the way ready to go. Now, you might be thinking, okay, hang on, it's a double-bladed sword. If you miss with the first blade, wouldn't the next one naturally miss anyway? Or if the opponent blocks it? No, not really. With whatever first strike you do, you can just step forward afterwards, so your second strike has even a greater chance of landing. And then if you are waiting for the opponent to strike first, there are multiple effective guard positions that you can employ. Something where it's more raised up, it'll take a bit more energy, but presenting that point to your opponent. Or there's even good at-rest guard positions where you're just kind of holding it low, it's there, ready to knock aside and defend. You can easily defend your legs by moving them back. And then when you deflect, you can easily strike back and really fast. And remember, each one of these attacks can also be switched to a defensive action very quickly. Instead of a strike, you can sweep, knock aside, reverse, and then hit again. And these blades are moving consecutively really fast in response to one another. I strike, I withdraw to re-engage, but then the blade is already there. Like these are fast, attacks. That would be very difficult to defend against, I think. Now, in all the experimentation that I've been showing here, notice how I've been holding the sword, like a spear, okay? So not the Darth Maul kind of double quarterstaff maneuvers thing. As I mentioned before, all the moves that I've been playing around with would be more difficult holding it like this. Again, mainly because of the crossguard and perhaps the length of the handle. But even with a longer handle, again, I still think you get more versatility, and honestly, the strikes, you just feel more engagement with your biomechanics, that there's more power behind them, holding it like this, just going in for a big old cut like that. I mean, there's a reason why we hold swords like this. We don't hold them like this, obviously, because, point of the blade, but also the way we want to engage our muscles, okay, just down in with a strike. strike. There's another part to a double-bladed sword that I think is worth considering, and that's the matter of spinning, okay? Spinning the actual weapon. Now, of course, usually when you spin a sword, dumb thing to do. You'd never do it in combat. But with a double-bladed sword, maybe there's a bit more viability in it, simply because there's a lot of blades swinging towards your opponent. They are twice as fast as if you were with a regular, blade. So hit, 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 hit. So these are pretty, fast consecutive. And I'm not doing it in casual. I'm not even trying to be fast here. But these blades are moving towards your opponent very quickly. Having said that, though, there is a crossover point that leaves you fairly open. When you go strike, strike, and you move down to crossover, there's no real guard position here. The blade isn't there. But having said that, there's a blade moving around to knock aside anything that might come in, and then you follow up with another strike. And so knock, hit, hit. So, I don't know, maybe. And we have to remember, this is also intimidating. If you're facing off an opponent with a weapon spinning like that, where it's just like, blade, 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 I mean, trying to time your attack to try and block these strikes that are just going crazy towards your opponent, okay. Look, you could defend against it, it'd be difficult. The other thing is, if you do defend against it, and say you're in a strike and they block, okay, this could lock away your weapon pretty good, I do admit, but there are other ways you can counter it and then hit again. So it's a bit too much of a complex thing for me to make a call on right now. I'd actually want to experiment with this with sparring against another person. Unfortunately, there's no HEMA club nearby that I could try it out with, but a lot of you guys are HEMA practitioners, and, I assume a good number of you might have rolling synthetics like this. I just went to my hardware store, bought these things. The thread is an 8W or W8 thread for the screws. And you just find an extra long nut like that and some washers so you get the right distance. And it also holds the grip in place. They don't bother you when you grab it. And then you've got a double-bladed sword you can play around with. And when I do have the opportunity to spar with someone, I know what I'm going to be trying out just to get a better read onto how effective this really would be. But from my own experimentation at the moment, I actually think there's some validity to it. It's looking pretty positive. Now, if these are effective, okay, there are a lot more people in the past who were fighting with swords. Why don't these things exist historically? Well, I think there's a number of reasons, okay? Because we've looked at the functionality, now let's look at the practicality. And this is a profoundly impractical weapon. I mean, can you imagine carrying this around? There's two exposed blades. It would be hard to keep two sheaths on it. It'd be hard to draw them quickly. And then it'll also be annoying to just carry this thing around everywhere. Now, one of the easy ways is just to unscrew the things. Mine's fairly tight, but, we'll get there. We'll get there, okay? Just unscrew them, and then you can put them in two sheaths, but drawing them out, very difficult. I mean, you got two swords ready to dual wield, and we know that dual wielding did happen in the past, usually as a novelty, and not with long swords. I mean, you can fight with long swords one-handed. It's difficult. They're not perfectly balanced for it, but still, I mean, you got them, and then if you wanted to fight with your opponents, and I'm not sure if you'd have time to screw them together. And the other thing is, why I don't think they would have been made in the past, is difficulty of making them, okay? When I was kind of saying you got to unscrew them, the types of threads we have in the modern day, way stronger, way more precise. They did have threads in the medieval period. We know this from unscrew the pummel in your opponent's rightly, and that's a big weakness of the sword. There's no pummel. What are you going to do? Fail! But, wait. Is the entire second sword a pummel? Sword pummel. This weapon just became the most epic weapon in existence. But yes, they did have threads in the medieval period. Again, so problems with it. They weren't as precise, weren't as strong, and I'm not sure they could hold a sword together as well as what we're seeing right here. So I do think if you did have a double-bladed sword in the past, it would need to be one piece, okay? And that's so profoundly impractical. No, and because you wouldn't carry this around as a weapon for self-defense, which is the role that the sword most predominantly filled throughout history. There are many cases it was a battlefield, but more predominantly, there was a weapon for self-defense, your sidearm. And this is not a sidearm, okay? If anything, this is a battlefield weapon. Yet there is another realm which it becomes far more practical, which is something we didn't see historically, but it's something we enjoy much nowadays. That's the idea of fantasy. Where fantasy is somewhat you need convenience to carry around, yet you know you're going to be fighting pretty large creatures, so you want weapons that can do serious damage and stuff like that. So I think the double-bladed sword is actually a more practical, plausible weapon in a fantasy setting than I know I had even given credit. I remember looking, Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, the double-bladed sword, it's like, that's just dumb. I have to eat a bit of humble pie, say, actually, not as dumb as I was thinking. But discounting fantasy and only looking at the historical context, like, if any, this would have to be a battlefield weapon, but it's not the best battlefield weapon just by the design of it being a sword, okay? You want a battlefield weapon to do generally one thing really, really well. So if your opponent's wearing armor, you want a weapon that can handle armor better than all other weapons. So it's like a mace or a polearm, okay? We're looking at the halberd or poleaxe, billhook. The spear is one of the most prominent battlefield weapons we see, you know, historically as well. Because the spear, you get even more reach. I mean, this is the length of the spear, but you know, you're not going to hold the blade. I suppose you could. There were times I held the blade, but with the amount of weight that's on the other end and how thin sword blades are, no, you're not going to hold it like this, okay? So spears get huge reach, so they're a better battlefield weapon than this. The poleaxes, halberds, better battlefield weapon than this. And so even though there's some certain advantages in a one-on-one scenario or even an adventuring scenario, it's not a good battlefield weapon, okay? It has ways that you could get in armor, you know, it's got, if you get particularly pointy, but when you're using a sword to try and jam it in between those gaps in armor, you need a bit more kind of control and articulation than this is really allowing, because to move, you know, this blade from one side to another, you have to kind of move it forward, around, and in. You can't switch the blade on one end because it is hitting you. That's the same limitation with a spear, mind you, but with a regular longsword like this, you have so much versatility to try and jam this point in your wherever the gap you want to get it. And you can connect with your opponent's blade, just feel out the pressure, get ready to get this point in where you want it. And of course you can half sword, and when you're half swording it, you got a lot of versatility as well. And so when fighting against opponents with like significant armor, I think you actually might want a regular longsword instead of this double-bladed sword. If you're fighting against a more unarmored opponent, maybe even unarmored creatures like goblins and monsters and things, again, I think this is still a pretty good pick. And I'm not saying it's completely ineffective against armor. You can still try and get it in points, but again, like I was trying to get the blade to this side to kind of jam it down and had to move it all the way around. So there are limitations because of its size. And I think these reasons that we've just explored here, the impracticality of carrying it around, the difficulty in construction, and also some of the limitations that you would find on a battlefield, because again, it's not the best battlefield weapon, and it's too awkward to carry around as a civilian self-defense weapon, it's too big. I think it's kind of obvious we didn't see them historically. Even though I do admit there are certain significant advantages that this weapon has, all right? And it's pretty cool. So again, this is actually a more plausible fantasy weapon, more than I was willing to regard it or consider it. If you haven't seen it already, do check out my review of Thanos' double-bladed sword. It's rather different to this one. And so for Darth Maul, yeah, you know, I'm willing to grant it. It's not ridiculous. And like for a fantasy adventure, go to town.